What I'll try to do in the presentation is go over some of the issues about what to do with the data that you get from doing climate budget tagging. Because frankly, if you just do the tagging, you've just got data and it doesn't really mean anything in itself. So you really need to think a little bit about what you're going to do with it and the kinds of questions you're going to use the data to answer. So let's go to the next slide, where I lay out 5 key things that I think we need to ask questions about. Risk and vulnerability, what the role of the public sector is, what kinds of policy instruments are best suited to dealing with the problems that we have in climate change, whether the kinds of this way we're spending money is aligned with policy, and how we're dealing with issues about accountability and participation. So those are pretty closely arranged with the traditional Musgrovian concept of what public finance is all about. So I think you'll all be familiar with some of the issues. Next slide. Where we really start on climate change is thinking a little bit about risk and vulnerability. 2 big areas of risks. One is physical risks, which is from extreme climate events like hurricanes, short-term droughts, much more long-term impacts through changes of ecosystems. The pictures on the left are of drying up of glaciers, which are major water source for some countries. Long-term changes in the agricultural potential of in countries. Second big risk is around decarbonization and the fact that all world economies are going to have to change over to minimize the use of fossil fuels, which means massive electrification and changing of fuel sources for all activity. And that's going to impact everybody, either through trade or through technological change and market transformation, market preferences. So everybody's going to be impacted. So how does this impact on our budgets and our financial matters? Well, the first thing is around explicit and contingent liabilities. So physical risks from climate change. You need to think a little bit about, well, what are the government liabilities going to come from dealing with the results of disasters? If disasters are going to become more frequent, more intense. If we're talking about transitions, if certain activities are going to be phased out, what are we going to have to deal with in terms of paying compensation to workers who are going to lose jobs? What are we going to deal with in terms of compensating businesses if you're changing regulatory frameworks and putting them out of business? Second area of financial impacts is around stranded assets. So we've all spent a fortune building coal-fired power plants, expecting them to operate for 30 years. Well, that may no longer be the case. Those assets may no longer be used for the full useful life of them. They may need to be decommissioned. So you need to look at your expenditure program and think, well, am I investing in things that are actually going to have a long-term future, or am I investing in activities that are actually going to be phased out? Another area you need to think a little bit about is about path dependence. Well, if a government is investing in an activity, you're telling your citizens that that activity is going to be a viable activity for the long term. So if you're investing in irrigation, you're telling your citizens that that irrigation scheme is going to be a source of income for them for their lifetimes. So you better be really sure that that irrigation scheme is going to function for that period of time. And think, well, are there any risks to this? Is the environment going to change? And what are the implications? Is that now a viable investment, or is it not a viable investment? Another issue you need to think a little bit about is early movers. The pressure now is going to be changing over to electrification and use of electric vehicles, electric sources for renewable energy. Now, a lot of these technologies are relatively new, some are very well established, but there are risks to being the first user of a technology. You've got to make sure that that technology is going to fit into your network. You've got to make sure that, think ahead and think, well, is it going to be the most efficient technology 5 years down the road? Is something else coming along that's going to be more effective? So think, okay, are there early mover risks to those kinds of investments? And last thing, you think a little bit about the orderly and disorderly transition. You know, how are you sequencing these things, these transitions? What messages are you sending through your budget in terms of how we're going to organize change, adaptation to climate change, and how we're going to decarbonize the economy, and what that information that provides to citizens and businesses about what the changes in activities they need to undertake. Move on to the next slide. Role of the public and private sectors. You know, we're all come from the background of ministries of finance, so we tend to think that the government is very important and the government is critical to all activities, which is to some degree true. But the fact of the matter is that the private sector and households will do most of our adaptation to climate change, and they will be responsible for decarbonizing our economies. Most of the investment in adaptation and most of the investment in decarbonization will come from businesses and households. And the public sector's role is really to help them do that. So the public sector's role is really about addressing market failures and providing the support to the private sector and to households to enable them to transition into this new climate environment. So typical issues where the public sector has a very clear rationale for investment is around information, providing information on what's going to happen in the future, gathering, monitoring what's happening in terms of climate change in the present and the near future. Organizing large networks like transport, energy, water, where, I mean, activities, individual investments may be undertaken by the private sector, but those private investments need to fit into a large network. And the public sector plays a very important role in regulating and managing that network and for providing key investment at key points of those networks. In innovation, the public sector will always be a very important player in terms of helping introduce new technologies. The picture on the right is about electric vehicles. In Japan, where one of the early movers on electric vehicles, it was led by the public sector putting in place charging centers in government offices and the government investing in charging centers for electric vehicles all over the country. The private sector would not have been able to shift into electric vehicles at all if that infrastructure had not been put in place by the public sector. So lastly, it's important to think a little bit about what the private sector is a partner for everything we do in the public sector. I think that's very important to think of from when we're sitting in ministries of finance and we're thinking very much about our public spending. In the end, everything we do deals with the private sector. We're buying products, services, construction of works from the private sector through traditional public procurement. So even when we're building a public asset in which we're going to operate, we're using the private sector to do that. Increasingly, we're using public-private partnerships so that the private operator is working with the public sector in terms of providing the operation of that asset as well, and providing a service as well as the construction and delivery of the asset itself. Similarly with concessions. So as you're looking through your climate change budget, it's important to think a little bit about, well, is this the best use of public funds? Is this something that the private sector could do better? Am I supporting the private sector in managing the transition to decarbonized economy or in terms of adaptation? So, though the focus is very much on public money, think of it in terms of public money to support the private sector and households. Let's move on to the next slide. So when we're thinking a little bit about climate change budgets and how to support the private sector and households in managing the transition to a decarbonized economy and in adaptation. We need to think a little bit about, well, what other ways have we got, tools have we got to manage that transition? Public money is a scarce resource, and we need to use it sparingly and in the ways that are most cost effective. We have other tools at our disposal. Information, simply telling people what we expect the risks from in the future to be, in terms of the physical changes that will come about because of climate change and the impacts of decarbonization. Providing plans that explain how the government is going to manage these changes over the longer term. This kind of information is very valuable to the private sector and the households, and helps them understand how they had to adapt to this changing environment. Regulation is very, very powerful tool, and it's relatively cheap in fiscal terms, though it merits its own analysis in terms of cost-benefit analysis from an economic perspective. But in fiscal terms, regulation tends to be fairly cheap and quite effective. Energy standards and emission standards have been a very, very effective tool in reducing emissions in many, many countries. We're very used to using regulation to manage land use, preserving protected areas, managing forests, ensuring the land is not overexploited, managing water resources as well. So regulation is a very powerful tool. We can also use taxation. Carbon taxes are particularly in the news at present. Many, many countries are looking at how they can put a price on carbon. The map on the right-hand side gives a picture of the current progress. I think this is dated in 2020, in terms of countries that have either emissions trading systems, which are based on regulations, or carbon taxes as a means of putting a price on carbon. As you see, most of the major economies are already working on this. Europe, large hole in United States, but California, which is the 6th largest economy in the world, already has a trading scheme. Kazakhstan has put one in place. China has many. So this is an area where there's a lot of progress, and it's recognized that it's probably one of the most effective ways of signaling to the market about how to plan an adjustment, both in terms of decarbonization. And the residual is spending. We have investment in new assets, recurrent spending on operations and programs that are supporting climate change activities. And an area which is very, very important is our tax expenditures. So where are we providing subsidies through our taxation system for economic activity? Unfortunately, much of the tax expenditures that are currently on people's budgets, particularly in Eastern Europe, are for fossil fuels. So we're actually subsidizing, damaging the environment rather than subsidizing activities that will support renewables and decarbonization. So I think when we're looking at our budgets, I think it's important to look and think, well, could we achieve this objective by other means? If we're trying to decarbonize or to encourage the private sector and households to adapt to inactivity, do we actually need to spend public money to do this? Could we do it by providing them with information? Could we do it by regulating? Could we do it by taxing activities that have a negative impact on the environment? So think of spending as your last resort, particularly in these times when budgets are particularly tight. So move on to the next slide. Once we've thought through the risks, once we've thought through the role of the public sector and the private sector, and we've thought through the kinds of instruments that we can have available, we can then start thinking, well, okay, how is the money that I'm spending actually impacting on the achievement of my policies? Because you're spending money to achieve something, and that's defined by your policy objectives. The fact of the matter is the amount of money that's actually spent on climate change in most countries is minuscule, is very, very small. The graphic on the right is a summary of the French 2020 budget, where they identified both mitigation and adaptation expenditures. And they identified 7% of their total budget as being supporting climate change objectives. That's both adaptation and mitigation. 2% of those expenditures were damaging the environment, mainly through fossil fuel subsidies. So I think when we're looking at our budgets, we need to think a little bit about planning for aligning those expenditures with our policies. How do the expenditures that are in the budget that we've identified actually align with the policy objectives that we have? But also thinking, okay, are there expenditures that are having a negative impact? And I think that many of the climate expenditure reviews have totally ignored this aspect. But the reality is that often the amount of money that's spent on fossil fuel subsidies or agricultural subsidies that have adverse impacts actually exceeds the amount of money that's actually supporting our climate change objectives, and it's totally contradictory. Now, I think there's a strong case for making this information very available to the public so they're able to see the inconsistencies in our policy frameworks and exert pressure politically on adjustments in those policies. Another issue that I think we need to think a little bit about is to what extent our expenditures are consistent with our climate change objectives. This gets a little bit back to the question of the role of the public sector versus the private sector. The reality is most of the funding that's needed to actually achieve climate change objectives is going to come from the private sector. So when you're looking at your nationally determined contributions and you're translating that into your long-term strategy into an expenditure program, you're probably thinking a little bit about, well, what's the residual that the public sector is going to be financing? You still need to think, well, is this level of financing sufficient to achieve the decarbonization objectives that your government has set? It's a complicated exercise. It does require some modeling. You can't do it just from your budget data alone, but the budget data is a resource for thinking through those kinds of policy issues. So just to summarize this slide, I'd say that the key issues to think through are to what extent the programs are actually aligned with the policies that you've set out, rather than just blindly assigning a tag to an expenditure. Think through, is this actually what our policies say that we're trying to achieve? And think through what are the expenditures that we're doing that are absolutely contradictory to our policies and are having adverse impacts on climate objectives, both in terms of adaptation and decarbonization. So move to the last slide. I think it's very important to think of your climate budgets in terms of a tool for accountability and participation. They are linked very much to targets, those in terms of targets for what you're trying to achieve in decarbonization, and targets in terms of resilience. Now, that's achieved, though, aligning with those targets comes through the work you would do in terms of policy alignment. There's also an element that's related to resource share. Now, I'm no great fan of setting targets for the amount of money that you're going to spend on climate change, but some countries have done that. Now, the EU in particular, European Commission in particular, has set a target for the share of its spending that it will assign to climate change. The World Bank has set a target for the share of its lending that it will assign to climate change. Now, setting those targets really does drive a shift in resources. I know from my own experience in the bank, we really fight to include climate change activities in projects because we have to meet a target share. And I'm sure all of you are very familiar with targets and the importance that's attached to them. And they can be quite effective in terms of driving a shift in resources. The question becomes, when is that a good target? Is it a sensible target or not? Because it can have perverse impacts in terms of shifting resources towards activities that may be possibly less cost effective, but they beat the target than other activities that may not make such a large contribution to the target, but may be more cost effective. So there are trade-offs, and as long as you're aware of those and can document it more effectively, the targets can be quite a powerful tool. I do think preparing a climate budget is a good basis for discussion with a broader group of stakeholders. You can discuss priorities. You can have the discussion about the choice of instrument. Now, on the right-hand side is a slide is a graph from the UK's Climate Assembly, which was a public consultation exercise undertaken to discuss what kind of climate policies the United Kingdom's government would implement. And they went through different kinds of policy instruments that will be used to achieve a net zero target, in this case, looking at trying to change people's behavior. And what was most acceptable to citizens was, in fact, issues around information, rather than punitive measures or measures that led to government expenditures. I think having a consultative process and participation really does help build ownership if you're going to sustain climate policies over the longer term, which is absolutely essential. I mean, look at the fast that we've had in the United States with reversals in climate policy, which over the last 2 administrations, back and forth on whether climate change is a policy priority, which are very detrimental in terms of getting the private sector and households to focus on the kinds of investments they need. So having a broad-based consultation can help avoid that by building broader agreement amongst a lot of stakeholders in what needs to be done. And you can build partnerships with the private sector and household and civil society on the kinds of policies that need to be implemented.